Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. Is it afternoon? It is afternoon. Hi, I'm Charles Conn. I am a Crown Fellow, and I used to be the warden of this house. So I will, until very recently, I will welcome you first to Oxford, where the weather is always like this. Never. And welcome on behalf of my successor, Elizabeth Quiche, to Rhodes House. You are in a remarkable place, and I think it's this is the oldest English-speaking university in the world, and has about 1,000 years of intellectual history here, and I hope you feel that, running through it. Of course, it also has lots of other histories that are more complicated. You can see some of those on the wall around you, which is an important part of it, actually. Your topic today is moral courage, which has a special resonance in this community, the Rhodes community. One of the four criteria for selecting Rhodes Scholars, in fact, the most important criteria for selecting Rhodes Scholars, is expressed in its original 19th century language: moral force of character and the instinct to lead. And although that's old-fashioned language, we still kind of like it. So force of character and the instinct to lead. I was speaking to someone today and realized that in the Rhodes community, there's something like 60% INTJs. There's a ton of people who are introverts, but who can force themselves into leadership roles when they see the need for that to happen. And I think, hopefully the conversation that we all have today about moral courage is about taking that step forward into leadership when it's required. All of the Rhodes Scholars do a character, service, and leadership retreat. Those retreats are done over the course of 2 years, done in these halls. I see someone who's been through the process. They're very similar to some of the seminars that you do at the Aspen Institute. And in fact, that's probably not a surprise, since 5 of the people who are just up on the screen happen to be Rhodes Scholars, including Elliot and Walter and Dan, and several others. So there's a really strong historical connection between Oxford and the Aspen Institute and the Rhodes Scholarships. And Penny's here in the audience. Soon we hope to have even stronger connections as we help launch Aspen UK. Can we talk about that? Okay, I just did. There, we did it. We did it. I'll stop talking, but I will say, being an Aspen Fellow fundamentally changed the course of my life. I was a McKinsey partner, and then with Mehrdad, actually. And then I became an entrepreneur, and I turned 40, and I sold my companies, and I was sort of lost, and I was trying to figure out what to do, and I had the great fortune to become a Crown Fellow. And being a Crown Fellow gave me the courage to be something different from being a business guy. And I guess that's a form of moral courage. So with that, I'll hand over to Jacqueline, who is right there. So over to you.
Thank you, Charles. And welcome to everyone else. It's amazing to hear you say the name Elizabeth Quiche, who is your successor, because I actually was in 8th grade algebra class with Mrs. Mahoney and Elizabeth, and already as a 12, 13-year-old, you could see the woman that she would become. And in terms of moral courage, I remember, I grew up in an immigrant military family, and so to meet someone like Elizabeth as a 12-year-old, and her dad was a senator who helped lead the Hungarian Revolution, and to have that implanted so young, and to know that she's here now taking that DNA into the next generation is really thrilling. I'm also a proud Aspen trustee and Crown Fellow, and you're all in for a treat with this next panel. April and the team, I just want to say thank you for what you all have done in bringing us together. They asked me to say just a few words about moral courage and what it is. And I think it starts with the definition, that the difference is that moral courage is really standing up on behalf of people outside your tribe, outside yourself. And in this moment where so many in the next generation are seeing the quote-unquote winners, really acting as if the world only rewarded those who see almost a philosophy of what's good for me is good for you. we really need role models that are willing to stand up on behalf of service, on behalf of purpose, and on behalf of community, which is, I think, what Charles is talking about, so that we can get more courageous. And in my own life, I have had the great privilege of being around so many people who live with true moral courage. I first encountered it as a 26-year-old when I helped start a microfinance bank in Rwanda, and one of my co-founders was this extraordinary nun named Felicula. And one of the first acts that we did with our little bank was to fight against the idea of bride price. And probably way too early for where the culture was. And as a result, Felicula was killed in a hit-and-run accident, most likely by government. And it was really the first time I confronted the true stakes that some people pay for rejecting the status quo. And then about 10 years later, I had started a fellowship program, and one of our fellows was named Ingrid Washinewatak, who stood on behalf of the indigenous people in the United States, and she was in Colombia working with the Uwa people in 1997 when she was mistakenly captured, most likely by the FARC, tortured and killed. And our fellows happened to be in Cape Town at the time. And so when I had to go and tell them what had happened to Ingrid. And when I did, we were at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and a great hero of Skull Forum, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, was there. And I told him what had happened. And he brought our group together, and he talked about how, as human beings, we yearn to be good, and that sometimes we're not so good. And the response to that not so good couldn't be more evil. It had to be forgiveness. And he suggested that when we would gather, we would leave an empty chair for that spirit, and that we would recognize for the rest of our lives that we were standing on the shoulders of greats like Ingrid, like Felicula, and that it was to us to carry that spirit forward. And so 2 of our little rooms in my organization are named for Felicula and for Ingrid, that you hold that, you carry that. Now I look at where we are in the world, and I think that we are having a non-conversation, that those same forces that opened the world from 1989 onward, in our generation really, capitalism and technology that lifted over 1 billion people out of poverty and helped us connect to one another, are the forces that are driving us apart, the forces that are creating division, inequality, fear, insecurity, and we're watching demagogues again prey on those insecurities and sometimes making us do terrible things. And so the idea of moral courage is real. And the need for community is equally as real, because we don't do this alone. It's too frightening. But when I think about who the community I get to be a part of is, it includes those people that refuse to do the easy, but embrace the difficult and do the right. And the courage that I think you're going to hear about, and I have known this next panel personally for many years, not I've had an epiphany and now I'm doing good, but for many years have really focused on trying and failing and enduring and trying again, speaking truth to power, but not in the way we too often see in the Twitter sphere of just outrage because we know it gets us clicks and likes, but rather with nuance, with recognizing truths and half-truths, even in those things that we hate, from the voice of somebody else, so that we can at least acknowledge that we see them and take a step forward, so at least they might have the possibility of taking a step forward toward us. The courage to show love and vulnerability and see that not as soft or as weakness, but as strength. And the courage to again, in a moment where, in my field of impact investing, we see a whole generation kind of roll their eyes at purpose and impact, the courage to find a way to reappropriate these words that for too many people have become empty. And through the way that we model as leaders 24/7 and the institutions that we build, show another generation that we're better than we think we are, and that it's to us to do the right thing, to somehow find a way to build a system that rewards not money, fame, and power, but service, purpose, and community. And my hope, as I see these amazing panelists, all of you, and moderator, is that they get a chance to really talk about their courage and open a conversation with so many of you who I also know personally, and do that work so that we can leave here a little more open, a little softer, a little fiercer, but definitely with more of a commitment to living from our own place of courage.
Hi, everyone. I'm Hildegard Vasquez from Panama. I'm a 2011 McNulty laureate, and I'm honored to share this panel with my fellow laureates. And it is an honor because moral courage comes with the joining of the minds and the joinings of the heart, as you described it, Jacqueline. And I want to introduce my fellow panelists into the seats. I want to start with Brett Jenks. Brett runs Rare and Fish Forever, and his canvas is global. He's really changing sustainable fish farming all over the world. So Brett, can you just come on over? Secondly, I want to introduce Réjane. Réjane Woodroffe is from South Africa, and she's made a small community in the east coast of South Africa, her canvas, and she has dedicated her life to changing that community. So thank you, Réjane. Come on up. And finally, Mehrdad, who is this last year's McNulty Prize laureate. He is a person who's changing civic engagement in youth, and he's doing that starting from Australia, but now he's moved all over the world, and he's really teaching how to change intolerance and how to really have youth think of the future. So if you're looking at your monitors, it says this isn't easy. And it isn't easy because it's a life's work that you all do. And I want to start by kind of looking at, and I'll look at my own story, where we find that sense of purpose that drives us. When I'm a restoration architect, and I started doing a lot of restoration work 22 years ago. And as a young architect, trust me, when I did my first building, I couldn't be more proud of myself. And when I got to my 10th building, I was even more proud. And I was changing a little old site in Panama City and making it become something new, different, that people wanted to visit. When I started, nobody wanted to show up in this site. But somewhere along the line, I was at a meeting generated by UNESCO to talk about this World Heritage Site and what it meant. And I was so, it's like everybody should stand up. I stood up and talked about my success. And it was wonderful. And then this small lady, young, she was a seamstress, a mother, stood up and said, well, for me, it means everything has gone wrong in my life. I had a roof over my head 2 months ago. And this guy just took the roof out of the house so we would move out like rats. And it rained that night, and I lost everything. I lost my home, I lost my job, I lost my sense of self-respect. And yes, you can imagine I moved from up here to the lowest level of a human being. I was doing this. I was displacing people through my work. And that's how I found my sense of purpose. And in a way, I think all of our stories connect. And I want to start with you, Mehrdad. where was it? Where did you find that sort of moment, or if there was a moment where you said, this is where I need to go?
Well, I think it's interesting because you have experiences as a child, and they sort of just get stored, and they don't necessarily come out until years later. And so my experience growing up as a Baha'i in Iran was one of confusion, because there were lots of members of society who thought Baha'is were untouchable and unclean. And so if they came to our house and I touched a glass of water, they wouldn't be able to drink from that if they came to our house. Or teachers who might touch me with the rubber tip of a pencil so that their finger wouldn't get dirty. So you experience that, but on the other hand, unlike, say, African Americans who would be visually identified as African American, I could walk on the street and not be identified as a Baha'i. And so other people would treat me normally. And so as a child, it's a bit confusing because it's only your belief that is causing some members of society to hate you. And so to be hated for your beliefs, which at the end of the day are, very progressive values about peace and equality of men and women and things like that, in that society was very confusing. And it kind of got stored, but what the big realization for me was that if people can learn this behavior, they can probably unlearn it. And I think over many decades, I thought about it, and really it was as part of the Crown program at the Aspen Institute, we're encouraged to create a project. And Jacqueline will remember, when we had to come up with ours, I went back to that experience and said, well, what could we do to help young people unlearn the hatred, the racism, the prejudice that they may have picked up? And there's a lot from learning science and other types of things that you could apply and create the right educational experiences for people to shed that. And that's what I dedicated myself to.
And Réjane, you were in the financial sector of South Africa, succeeding away. And then what happened? You moved into this community, and it's your life.
Sure. I think similarly, the comments that Mehrdad spoken about, resonates very strongly because things start early. I was born in 1974 into apartheid South Africa, and as somebody of mixed race, I was on the wrong side of that law. So I grew up with whites-only signs that physically barred you from going to certain areas, kept me away from other fellow South Africans of different races. And we were forcibly removed from our home in District 6 and moved to a colored township where I grew up. And I then became a very active part of the anti-apartheid struggle during my schooling years. And I was there when Nelson Mandela, who's looking over us today, walked out of prison in 1990, holding Winnie Mandela's hand and giving us the power salute as he walked out of prison. And that was in 1990, and then we were excitedly prepared to vote for the first time. I was just old enough to vote in 1994. And then we all thought, well, now the job is done. Let's get on with our lives. Apartheid's been defeated. We have democracy. And I went to business school and studied finance and started this career, successful career in finance. And as a non-white woman at the time, my prospects were great. And I rode that tide. And in 2004, I then come to a community that's 40 kilometers away from where Nelson Mandela was born and grew up, and it was the poorest district in our country. And it's a place where more than half of the women there have lost at least one child to diarrhea. 1 in 9 have lost 3 or more. I know families have lost 8 or 9 children from lack of access to clean drinking water and sanitation. And that's what I've dedicated my life to finding solutions for.
Thank you. Brett, you come from a river. And it's a river that guides your interest in the environment. And I want you to describe where that sort of river flows from you.
Sure. So I was born in Chillicothe, Ohio, which is in the southern part of the Midwest of the United States. My grandfather was a pig farmer. My great-grandfather was a pig farmer. My grandfather ran a gas station, and my father was able to go to college, first guy in the family to go to college. So I got to grow up as the son of a traveling management consultant, and they got very lucky. We were able to leave this town that has been in steady decline for about 200 straight years. Very depressed place. This is Donald Trump country, with a lot of challenges. We have the town's main source of revenue was a paper mill, which means it stinks to high heaven every single day. And so my grandfather saved up money pumping gas to buy a 1-acre plot on a place called Paint Creek, just over the hill away from the smell of town. And so every weekend he would sleep out there, and sometimes he would get grandma to go sleep with him. And, but often he was alone, and that's when as a kid, that was where I fell in love with nature, on Paint Creek. Everybody out there was generally white, racist, relatively reconciled to the notion that there would be no change, there would be no growth economically, that this place has been stagnant since I was a child. And at age 10, it occurred to me, having lived in other parts of the world and come back to this little place, that this was both my identity, but also my challenge. And so somewhere, the love of that little creek and those little endangered darters that we used as minnows and found out later are some of the most pristine endangered waters of the United States. For us, it was just a place to fish and eat. That led to me somehow or other ending up committing my life to conservation in a way that benefits and respects the people who live in those places, meeting them where they are. And I've really never done anything else.
So all of our McNulty laureates are very humble. So they tell you like where they found their purpose, but everything that they're doing are changing the world and the perspective that we have for the world. And I'll give you a little bit of my story. I told you what that woman did to me, but then what I did was I decided that I wanted to change every single woman that looked like her, so they could have an opportunity to reap the benefits of the economy and not be outside of the system. How could I teach them to actually understand that if they got a job, they could actually stay within the system? But it wasn't easy, because just teaching technical stuff was not going to make them do the changes that I thought they needed to change in the urban poor relationships that they had. So I decided, no, I'm going to teach them soft skills. I'm going to teach them to love themselves. I'm going to teach them to look in the mirror and love the woman they are. I'm going to tell them violence doesn't stop you. It doesn't impede you. You can, and yes, you can. And if you can, your family can. And if your family can, community can. And if community can, then countries can. And then you become this obsessive person that you want to change the world. And so I want to go back to Réjane, because you walked into this community and you kind of said, we can do this and this and this and that. How is that working for you?
Yeah, it's sometimes the easy part is what to do, because when you have a community that really has no access to any kind of government services. When I first came in 2004, there was no road, no running water, no electricity, no access to healthcare, education. So what to do is almost easy, and you can get very caught up in that. You can be caught up in the, do the education, do the home-based care, but what really sustains you and what helps you through the tough times and even making the tough decisions that you have to do is the why, and keeping in tune with why you do something. And what has really sustained me is that this is my community. I mean, I live in this community. I live in a mud house with a grass roof, and I've lived with solar energy and rainwater, and And when you're living in a community that your dearest friends, your people who become your family, are living next door, then the why is never far away. You always know why you're doing it, and that helps you to, with the tough decisions. And the toughest decisions really are about trying to do good without doing harm. I think that is the hardest thing in this work, if I could think of one thing that's really, really hard. And just to give you, there's so many examples, but just to give you, one or two examples, we did, one of the things we do is access to legal services, and what is the law about, and how does the Constitution of South Africa and the law of the country interact with traditional law, and sometimes not interact in a very easy way, and they can clash. And we do these community workshops, and we say, well, there's a Constitution of South Africa, there's a human rights bill and human rights law, and women have rights and children have rights. And an old man stands up and he says, well, if women have rights and children have rights and I get old and they've got the right not to look after me, who's going to look after me? And I don't have an answer to that question. There is no answer to that question. Or if you have a scholarship program where you have bright kids on a scholarship program doing really, really well, and they come home for the holidays in grade 8, and the mom says, well, he doesn't really want to stay here for very long anymore because he goes to school in the city now, and he's been doing it up till grade 8. And, there are no toilets in the community, the kid's been living in the city, a flush toilet. So the grandmother's hurt, he doesn't want to come home. And, those are the really tough parts of you've got to deal with every day.
Mehrdad, how did you start? What was, what got you going into, and what were the hard decisions that you had to make in the process to get this going?
Well, I guess to some extent the starting happened because of the Crown program, and Charles, one of the greatest gifts anyone's ever given me was when he nominated me for the Crown program, because it forced me to have a project. And so really in my case, the project was a joint one with my wife. And we didn't want to have something that was going to be yet one more thing that I'm doing away from the family. And so we said, if we're going to do it, this would be something we will do as a family. And we spent a while thinking about what that would be, and we went back to this core. So that part of it was reasonably easy. I think that there were a couple of other points along the way that were challenging. So we started in one school, there was amazing results, and then there were 5, and then there were 10, and we hired a few more people, and we're funding this ourselves. And we got up to about 100 schools in Australia, and then there was really a point where, actually we've landed on something that is worth spreading, and we need to do something more with it. And so we had to change the model. We had to kind of apply all the things I had learned in the business world to try to create a not-for-profit that could actually support itself. And so you roll forward to today, we're in about 400 plus schools in Australia. We work with 200,000 kids and in a multi-year program, and the program is entirely self-funding through school fees. And so this is something that can go on. And our goal is, right now we're working with 5% of young people. We think we could be working with 50% of young people in Australia in a small number of years. So that was one important point, is changing the business model. I think the other one was this moment where about a year and a half ago, I think following all the incidents of hate that were coming out around the world, I'm not just talking about the US, although I think the US is particularly noteworthy on it in the last 2 years, but it became kind of something that was going on. And I felt like a fraud, because on the one hand, I was talking about this project being so important. On the other hand, I'd spend 80%, 90% of my life making money in a business, a number of businesses, and it just didn't feel right. And
what is it about that felt like a fraud?
well, if I really believe this is the most important thing I can do, then why am I not all in? Why am I showing up every morning trying to invest and make some more money? So the decision was, are we really authentic about this and real or not? And if we're from a place of integrity, then walk away, which is what I did. And so, there was transferring a lot of business leadership things to other people and stepping into, drive this thing global, pro bono, which I've been doing for the last year and a half. And, we're now in the US, Canada, Brazil, China, India's coming shortly. and a bunch of other countries. So it was one of those things where if I really believed in it, then I needed to change my life to match it.
So where's fear in that, Brett? How do you, I mean, Mehrdad just described this level of fear that, makes a life decision, it changes your life, it changes your perspective. Wealth becomes that unimportant, it's the work that you're doing, and if wealth is not there, then you don't care because it's about the work. So where does fear come in for you? Where do you get that courage to do the stuff that you're doing?
It's funny, I felt really uncomfortable walking in here and looking at that sign and those two words, moral courage. I don't feel very courageous at all. I feel completely weak, frail, challenged, afraid of failure several times a week. I think I'm desperately afraid that we're going to lose in several of the things that we're trying to do right now. We are in a transition similar to Mehrdad's, where during my Cato Fellowship at Aspen, we reread Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons, and I had an epiphany, which was common pool resource management is the humanitarian challenge. It is the human challenge, and it's how do we manage the planet? Because we are now like a small child staring at her hands, not knowing how to drive this thing that we literally are physically now in charge of. We manage the temperature of the planet. We manage the entire landscape. We are working on managing the bottom of the sea as the last frontier. We're in charge, but we have no idea how to do this. That, to me, should make us all terrified. So I worry about our ability, given what I call the three horsemen of the apocalypse: robotics, genetic engineering, and climate change, all coming crashing at our generation. And you have to ask yourself, are we going to be able to manage responsibly this new power, these new technologies? To me, that's just utterly terrifying. So fear is common. I guess the question is, what do you do about that fear? And so for me, it's actually not, this may sound nihilistic, but it's not actually an existential fear, because I know I'll only live another 30, 40 years. We all will only live our one life, but we're part of something much bigger than ourselves, this species, this journey. So the question is, we know we're going to end. What can we do while we're here? And so in thinking about common pool resources, the question becomes, can we evolve culture faster or fast enough to keep up with that technological innovation? And that means, for example, how do we manage common pool resources on the ocean? How do we empower the world's poorest people to band together and make collective decisions to ensure that they can feed themselves while protecting the natural resource that provides that annuity every day that defines their culture? With climate change, the mean average temperature of the planet for 250,000 years, at least the last 15,000 we know has been 57 degrees Fahrenheit. It's gone up in the last 250 years, 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. Look at what has happened. We're on target for it to go up 6 to 7 more. If that doesn't make you afraid, I don't know what would. And so can we make it personal? Can we make climate change, can we make managing the planet a personal endeavor? And I think that's what we should all be afraid of.
Identity politics has, in a way, taken the conversation of where we stand in the world in a very kind of divisive way. How do you see, if we look at his idea of the world, where it's like, there's the fear of that we're going to destroy it because we can't get our heads together into identifying as a humanity that we are. Where do you, as a fellow, work on that? And how is it like that we can join forces to really think of the world as one place for all? Mehrdad?
Well, I think there's two things that come out of that we try to do in our programs. And the first one on the identity is getting young people to see themselves as a member of a single human race and to realize that a lot of the divisions are artificial constructs. And actually, the simulations that we play with young people allow them to have those epiphanies. So I think I need to describe one to give people a sense of what it would be like. So imagine you're in a room about this size, 60 young people walk into the room, and they're each wearing a photo of someone from around the world on a lanyard. And we give them a simple instruction, which is find your people. And only by looking, they're not allowed to talk. And almost all the time, young people will decide to group by race, and occasionally by gender. And then you ask them to go a bit richer and have conversations about identity, which is on the back of the card, like what music they like, food, and so on. And they get much greater interest in understanding of identity and diversity and so on. But the question they can't escape is when you ask them, well, why did you decide to group by race? What was it about race that was so important? And they begin to realize that that's something that they've learned and acquired as opposed to anything that has any real meaning. And well, then who's advantaged by you doing that and why? And do you want to be a part of that or so? So I think that's the kind of process. The other one, which goes to what Brett was talking about, is I think the reason, for example, whether it's climate change or these other things, people don't participate is because we've decided that what we do doesn't matter. That's what we've learned. You know, global warming is such a big problem, climate change is such a big problem, that my actions alone aren't going to make a difference. And that's true, my actions alone won't make a difference. But if everyone believed the way I believe, then certainly it wouldn't make a difference. So how do you actually get people to see that what they do matters? And again, using gamification, we start with something really simple, like for a day, you're going to score yourself. Every time you pick up a piece of litter, that's a +1. If you walk by, it's a 0, and if you drop 1, it's -1. If you convince someone else to pick up litter, 10 people, then that's +10. So score yourself on a score of, for an hour or a day. And then instead of litter, it's your words. If you make people hurt or feel bad about themselves, that's a -1. Really bad, that's a -10. If you make someone cheer up or do something nice for someone, it's a +1. Now, what's interesting is then that starts transferring, and then a young person realizes that when she took the garbage in the cafeteria and put it away, and 20 other people followed, that what she did actually mattered. And that is the big change. When you realize that actually your choices do make a difference, and they do get others, then it doesn't matter whether the problem is climate change, bullying, pick it. Pick any problem you want. Your behavior is starting to make a difference, and then it becomes actually quite empowering.
So we're painting a vision of a world where we think climate change is going to do, and then you paint a vision of, okay, if we join together, if we really think that each one of us, pick your passion, pick your purpose, whatever drives you, and say, this is going to be part of my life's work. And you picked your purpose in a very small community. And it's just, that's the canvas that you think is going to drive that vision to the future. What is the future for you, Réjane? How do you see that vision?
Sure. Of course, I've been incredibly influenced by living for so many years now in this community, and realizing that in an organic and in a lived way, that the real solutions to problems come from the communities themselves. And you can be so surprised by what a solution to a youth development program, a health program would be. Not something that was hatched in a university or in some kind of study, but actually what communities themselves come up with. Of course we do a range of different projects across the spectrum because we've had to. You can't give a child a scholarship if she has no clean drinking water to drink, or mom doesn't have the multivitamins she needs when she's pregnant, or access to HIV testing or medications. And so we do the range from sort of from healthy pregnancy all the way through early childhood development, primary school education, high school education, income generation projects. So there's a lot there. And the solutions that come up and the contributions that we've made, both to national policy, to government, where just one example would be when you're rolling out a new road to health card for communities, and we find that when they printed the health and growth chart that the home-based care workers are using in the home, the 2 had been fallen off the 2.5 kgs, and it was showing 5 kgs on the graph, and millions of these have been printed and going out to communities everywhere. Obviously, the height, the weight for height chart is incredibly important to prevent stunting. And the only reason why I picked that up is because I'm in the home with a home-based carer. So the best place for me to be is on the ground in communities, and I love doing that. That's where I find my purpose, and that's where I'm rejuvenated every day and where I understand my why. So if you want to take one of our programs, let's say a youth program that came organically from the youth, which was actually called the Bulungula Radio, which is a radio station that cost $300 in total just for the transmitter, and thousands of young people are now participating in this, volunteering, and it's taken no money or any intervention from the organization. It's just this explosion of this youth program that's having so many benefits. If you want to take, let's say, one success like that, and you say, well, where's the scale in that? And so there's the position for the scale. I'm the wrong person to scale that. I should continue to be on the ground in the communities, and there could be other people that are best placed, and this is what I'm wanting to talk to people who are in those positions, some of them funders, some other organizations. If you're a funder that funds programs across Africa, and you know the program in Uganda or Kenya that could pull on this one thread that we found success in, then can you find a way to take what we've done and you scale it? Because if I scale it, I'm not going to be on the ground anymore. So trying to find a way to build that toolkit, to write that story, and to bring those partners on board is really part of the next step in our journey.
So climate change needs an accelerated possibility, as the theme of this convening is. How do you accelerate what you're doing? How do we fix that?
So over the last 4 weeks, 3 months really, 12 weeks, I've been thinking about how to start something brand new at home for the first time. I've worked only outside of the United States in other people's communities for my whole career. I've literally not worked in the United States since I was 24 years old, and that was more than 10 years ago. So in the last, let's say, few months, it has occurred to me that there is a way for the United States to get back on track to hit its target under the Paris Agreement. That if 10% of Americans were to adopt 7 behaviors, we could get back on track. And so we're beginning to design a whole new way, a whole new program, a whole new set of products. We may end up needing a new organization and a new board and new funding streams. But the idea is basically that, I call them the A to G. So adopt a plant-based diet, buy carbon offsets, contract for green energy, don't waste food, electric vehicles, make that your next purchase, and fly less once. And each of those is targeting 5 to 10% of Americans in particular areas with particular demographics. And the 7th behavior is to tell everybody you know that you're doing that, so that, as Mehrdad was referring to earlier, the idea is if you want to address climate change, make it personal. And make it so personal that it becomes the story that you tell everyone else. If we could literally get 5 to 10% of Americans to adopt those 7 behaviors, that adds up to almost a gigaton of carbon, putting us back on track to hitting Obama's original Paris Agreement pledge. And so the question is, can we change? Can Americans change? And if we do, it would certainly boost the confidence in a number of other countries that this change is possible. Because right now, the sense that America is doing nothing, or just in the cities on the coast, is really holding us back. And so that is a very big risk, and I've decided I'm going to take it.
So being an Aspen Fellow, would it be all over the world? It's not only an honor, it's a process that leads you from success. You might be very successful in life and doing all these things, but we all look for significance, because significance in a way, and if we go back to the Greeks at Aristotle and Plato, we look at how we, as human beings, look for happiness in the wrong places. And in a way, significance is another vision of happiness. It's the happiness that brings Brett, Réjane, and Mehrdad this sense of purpose. And this purpose that has driven their whole life came out of a venture, out of a seminar, where they sat down and really analyzed who they were, where they stood in the world, and what was their passion, that inherent thing that drove them to a different place. And we've all heard that these are complicated problems, identity politics, you know, a single village in South Africa that needs a community and it's building community. Or, you know, what about climate change? And we all sit, and I think I've heard from all of them, we all sit and think, oh no, that can't be solved. Brett is saying, let's look within ourselves. We all have a tool that we can use, and we can go back and say, this is important. Whatever is it that matters to us, be it for me, empathy, and loving women in a different way, and making sure that gender is considered important, and that women are not left behind. And so I want to end this panel to really thank them for it, because it takes a lot of courage to stand here and say, you know, this is personal. This is not, I'm not working on development in a, you know, sort of a, it's not a job. It's a life's work. So thank you very much. Okay. You have within you, in some papers, there is a booklet that shows different case studies for the McNulty Prize laureates. Please read them. They're all tracking, like really doing incredible work. And I want to also have some questions from the audience also. So if you all have questions for the panelists, hold on, they're going to bring the mic.
Thank you about the climate change. I think it's a fabulous idea because nobody's doing anything about it. So how can we help you? What is the action plan you can give everybody here to do the same thing? I think everybody would love to be in this movement. Can you share?
I'll just say, you know what we should probably do? Let me just say my email, and if this is something you'd like to be involved with, just send me an email. We're literally going to be building a movement around this. And so we'd love to have you involved. So it's B as in boy, Jenks, B Jenks, at rare, RARE.org, and just make the subject line, make it personal.
But if we just did the 7 things that you listed, we would be...
Well, here's where it's a little complicated. So every country is going to have a different list. So if you live in the developing tropics, and you have an agrarian society, chances are that 144 going on 190 nations signed the Paris Agreement. Mm-hmm. In doing so, they established an individual commitment for their country, which leads to what's called an NDC, which is how those governments outlined their individual contribution. So in your country, you will have a different pie chart and a different set of priorities. In the United States, one of the biggest source of greenhouse gas is home energy and transportation, major greenhouse gas emissions. If you're in Colombia or Brazil, for example, it's deforestation, it's land use. So every country is going to have a different mix, and ideally, we're going to be developing, we have some of the leading advertising agencies and sort of social media beneficial manipulators, let's just say, who are interested in this idea, who want to help figure out a psychographic pie chart that then matches those NDCs so that we could actually have a global strategy. But we're not there yet. We're going to focus just on the United States for the first year and then offer that up probably through the UN to a network of other countries.
Okay. Thank you.
If we get lucky.
Any other questions?
Thank you. I thought you made a very profound point about doing good without doing harm, which I think sometimes we just assume there's not another side of it, but oftentimes there is. And a lot of what you're talking, all three of you are talking about, are changing systems on which a lot of people have made their livelihoods, make their livelihoods. And so at the same time that we need to drive these changes in behaviors, we're also constantly need to think about how can we craft a future where everybody can land with dignity, you know, including the millions of people whose lives are now based around a different way, you know, the old ways that we've been doing things. And these people aren't all bad people. Most of them are not. So as you all think about all of the positive things that you're trying to make happen, and you think about the changes, the sort of massive societal changes that you're trying to drive, where in that equation does, you know, the disruptive side of that, does anyone pay for the disruptive side of that? And if so, how do you think about engaging with those communities? Was that clear?
I think so. I mean, you know, should I?
Yeah.
I mean, it's something we think about all the time, you know, what is the impact and the outcome of what you do, and where do you go with the disruption? I think the problem is the disruption's coming. Things are going to change. So you either part of that change and try to do your best to be thinking about it on a daily basis and actually applying your mind to where does this go, rather than sitting back and saying, well, I don't want to destroy an old way of life, which might have been good in some ways, but when, you know, you change things, whether it's through education or different farming practices, or you know, you enable people to farm more productively and have an income, but that could affect the land use. There are always trade-offs. I'm an economist by training, and trade-offs is, you know, sort of what you deal with all the time in economics. And so there are going to be these trade-offs. You know, in our community, nobody has a TV yet, but the TVs are coming. And so, you know, should I say children shouldn't watch TV, and should that be the message that we put out to the communities? Well, it's going to come. So is there a way to say, well, if you have a TV, it could be positive and it can be done this way, and when you access the internet, do you say to kids, oh, the internet's bad, don't access it? Well, it's going to happen. So I think the change is huge, and we all know, and I think a lot of us are nervous of the change. I mean, there's so much talk about, you know, the new jobs, and well, how do you educate kids, and what are they going to do, and how's this connectivity going to affect things. We got cell phone signal 2 months ago, so, you know, there's going to be a rapid change coming. So the only thing we could do is, instead of trying to push back against it or avoid it, is to be part of it and try to make it a positive force for good, the changes, as best we can, and apply our minds to that, rather than being afraid and trying to stop it, because that's not going to happen.
Okay, one last question right here. Yeah, in front.
Hey there. A quick question on exercising moral courage. For me, oftentimes means looking at the mirror and trying to overcome the imposter syndrome that we face. How do you build and lean on your personal support systems to keep going? Because this is a lifetime of work. So how does that play out in your personal space, in your personal lives?
We were talking right before we started about our families, and your support space of family was very important. And maybe, Mehrdad, you can explain a little bit how family has helped you there.
So, I mean, in our case, High Resolves, which is our program, is really our second child. We've thought about it that way. Our son is 21, and we think High Resolves is about, you know, it's only 13 years old, but it feels like a 17, 18-year-old in the way it works. And so really, at the dinner table, you know, and we tend to have a tech-free dinner. And we always, if we're in the same town, all three of us sit down and we have conversations, and really the fourth chair is High Resolves. And it feels like a member of the family. And our son, who's a filmmaker, does a lot of the videos and so on. So I think that helps, because the trade-offs that are being made in our lives, both in terms of, you know, I'm doing 5 round trips around the world in the next few months. That's not a lot of time on the ground. So, you know, how do you reckon? Well, if your family wasn't committed to it, and my wife's doing similar things, it wouldn't make a sense. I think the real part of your question, though, rather than the balance, is when you discover in yourself the things you're trying to train young people not to do. And I don't know whether there's, I haven't met anyone yet who I think would be completely, unblemished from some of these things we're talking about. So I think what happens is discovering some of those in your day-to-day life and catching yourself in moments where you didn't behave in integrity with what you do. Those are, I think, much tougher. And again, it helps to have an organization. I'd just add one other thing to the answer to your question, which helped me a lot. We started an exercise last year. We have about 51 people in the organization now. We did an exercise collectively to say, what do we think our character is and should be? And so it wasn't this sort of aspirational, what are the values we want to have for the organization? It was, if people met high resolves, what would they say is our character? And so collectively, the group came up with 10 statements about our character, like, for example, being pioneering, being bold, being purpose-driven, things like that. And but then we also said that each one of us is not necessarily living up to the full potential of all 10. And so we have these postcards, and every single person in the organization has one of the 10 postcards up in their desk at any given time. And it's the element of character that they think they need to work on the most that week, that month, and it becomes a conscious choice to say, yeah, I'm going to try to be better at that.
I would add one other thing to Mehrdad's list, and something that has really been helpful to me over the last 25 years, but only probably the last 10, and that is when you're trying to do something that is your job, your hobby, your passion, your every waking hour, it's a serious burnout challenge. It's a recipe for personal failure. And about 10 years ago, I realized I was just doing a horrible job as a leader. I was highly critical of, nothing was good enough within the organization. I felt like I was just constantly ripping out the molding in the kitchen, and no one could meet any standard, and I was suffering. Probably everyone was suffering deep down. I was probably suffering the most. And it took some good advice and a 360 degree, my third out of 5, to finally realize the problem was me, no question. And if I couldn't forgive myself for every mistake I made every day, no one else was ever going to be good enough. No program would be good enough. So I think we, as people who are, anybody who's here is a high achiever trying to do something significant in your life. And I think having a heavy dose of self-forgiveness is going to make you a much more enjoyable collaborator. So if you haven't had that epiphany, you take the pill.
Thank you, everybody. I think if we all look at where we stand in the world and their personal journeys, it's not easy to stand up sometimes to things and stand up maybe even to yourself in the mirror and say, am I really the person I should be? And is this work really the track that I need to lead? And it's a personal journey. It's a very introspective journey of understanding your values, where you stand, and how and where you want to lead. What's really beautiful about what they did is they've chosen that purpose that they think is what's going to lead them into the next step. And I think there's so many possibilities coming out of this panel. I mean, Brett, you're going to get all these people writing down their emails. So thank you very much. We're not closing yet. So we're going to take a break. But before we take the break, we're going to read a poem. You all have a poem in your seats.
Do you want to look at it?
And I need at least 1 or 2 volunteers who would want to stand up and read the poem. Do you want to read just the first stanza? Thank you. Just read the first stanza and find your poetic voice.
My what voice?
Poetic voice.
Poetic voice, okay. Under a sky the color of pea soup, she is looking at her work growing away there, actively, thickly like grapevines or pole beans, as things grow in the real world, slowly enough. If you tend them properly, if you mulch, if you water, if you provide birds that eat insects a home and winter food, if the sun shines and you pick off caterpillars, if the praying mantis comes and the ladybugs and the bees, then the plants flourish, but at their own internal clock.
Somebody would like to continue? Alexander?
Connections are made slowly. Sometimes they grow underground. You cannot tell always by looking what is happening. More than half the tree is spread out in the soil under your feet. Penetrate quietly as the earthworm that blows no trumpet. Fight persistently as the creeper that brings down the tree. Spread like the squash plant that overruns the garden. Gnaw in the dark and use the sun to make sugar.
Oh, you can continue. You're beautiful. Read the next one.
Really?
Yes.
Does anyone else want to go?
Anybody want to go?
Okay. Weave real connections, create real nodes, build real houses, live a life you can endure, make love that is loving. Keep tangling and interweaving and taking more in, a thicket and bramble wilderness to the outside, but to us, interconnected with rabbit runs and burrows and lairs. Live as if you liked yourself, and it may happen. Reach out, keep reaching out, keep bringing in. This is how we are going to live for a long time, not always. For every gardener knows that after the digging, after the planting, after the long season of tending and growth, the harvest comes.